prefect of Egypt, Aemilianus, who revolted in 262, and the commander of the garrison at Byzantium, who revolted around the same time. Even Gibbon is quick to point out that the 30 Tyrants is a transparent piece of rhetoric, referencing the old 30 Tyrants of Athens, the post-war government installed by Sparta at the end of the Peloponnesian War. And the list of usurpers offered by the Historia Augusta has been thoroughly debunked, with most of the men listed having never assumed imperial dignity or having never existed at all. Despite the exaggerations, though, there is no doubt that the sheer number of men challenging Gallienus' rule during the 260s, however many there actually were, points to near uniform disenchantment with his administration. Or does it? As we've mentioned elsewhere, the histories relied upon to establish narrative continuity for all our archaeological evidence were written by men of senatorial rank for men of senatorial rank, and the biases of that class dominate the portrayals of the various emperors. The Senate had no love whatsoever for Gallienus, as he famously delivered a major blow to their power and prestige. During the reign of Gallienus, the Senate was once and for all excluded from having anything to do with military affairs. Now, it is interesting to note two things about this development. One, despite claims to the contrary, it does not seem that Gallienus issued some dramatic decree banning senators from serving in the army. And two, that nothing he did was in any way a radical departure from the policies followed by Marcus Aurelius during the Marcomannic Wars. Gallienus' problem, as had been Marcus's problem, was that the situation was so critical that there was very little margin for error. Bringing in some rich, inexperienced aristocrat to run a legion in the middle of a war zone, simply because that was the way things had always been done, was a really good way to get that legion wiped out. Marcus had responded by elevating capable, experienced soldiers like Pertinax, Pompeianus, Pescennius Niger, and Maximianus, none of whom were of senatorial rank, rather than turning to self-entitled senators. Gallienus too followed this policy, and the men he turned to lead his armies were all career military men, who would in time go on to return the empire to something resembling its former glory, including Claudius Gothicus, Aurelian, and a young Probus. None of these men were of senatorial rank or aristocrats in any sense of the word, but they knew soldiering, and Gallienus trusted them, and that was all that mattered. And in the long run, it was probably better for Rome. As Gallienus shut out inexperienced senators from military postings, young, ambitious aristocrats were unable to gain even basic military experience, creating a feedback loop which led Gallienus and his successors to completely ignore the senatorial class from now on when looking to fill out the officer corps. Gallienus also introduced a subtle shift in the way that provinces were governed that further calcified the division between civilian and military leadership. The rank of legate, that is, the leader of a single legion, was rebranded as the legatus equitus, and now made unavailable as an office to a senator, reserved instead for career military men of equestrian rank. Senators were still duly appointed as governors of the provinces, but the legions of the provinces were put in the hands of men who knew what they were doing. In provinces where there was only a single legion, a situation that traditionally led the governor to double as that legion's legate, well, those were transformed into equestrian prefectures, a model invented by Augustus when he was trying to figure out how to maintain personal control over Egypt without having to worry about senatorial interference. All of these affronts to their dignity, whether they were justified or not, really rubbed the Senate the wrong way, and when the empire successfully emerged into the 4th century, the history of the 3rd century began to be reworked by conservative members of the senatorial class into a series of morality plays that had a clear cast of heroes and villains, with emperors like Claudius, and Tacitus, and even Aemilianus painted as paradigms of republican virtue, while Gallus, Gallienus, and Aurelian were painted as cruel, lazy, or ineffectual, depending on the man. The Historia Augusta, for example, expends a great deal of ink praising Posthumus, who was, after all, nothing less than a traitor to Rome, in order to contrast him with the terrible, no-good Gallienus. Odenathus, as I've already mentioned, received similar glowing treatment. This is not to take away from the accomplishments of Posthumus and Odenathus, but it is interesting to note how much praise is heaped on the two men who did the most to divide the empire. Despite this friction with the upper classes, Gallienus did manage to stay in power for 15 years, so he had to be doing something right. After the tumultuous years following the capture of his father, one of the main lessons the emperor took away was that if he was going to maintain his tenuous hold on the Middle Empire, and perhaps one day win back the East and the West, he was going to have to do a better job making sure that the army still under his command remained loyal to him and did not jump to their local generals every time someone said boo. Now, it was not exactly a mystery how you kept soldiers in the 3rd century loyal to you, and Gallienus was no dummy. Thus, one of his lasting legacies was the founding of multiple mints across the empire. Up until this point, besides the main mint in Rome, there were only a few major coining centers in the provinces, making transporting soldier pay and promised bonuses both time-consuming and dangerous. So Gallienus founded at least 4 new mints near all the major military headquarters in northern Italy and along the Danube, which kept the soldiers paid in full and on time, and left them, as you can imagine, extremely well disposed towards their emperor. The downside of this increase in mints, though, was that it sped up a process that the Romans did not understand at all, but that we today are well acquainted with and very watchful of: inflation. Now, like most of you, I learned about inflation from the classic DuckTales episode Do, Re, Mi, when Huey, Dewey, and Louie got their hands on a duplicating ray and used it to duplicate some money so they could have enough to go buy a new bike. But of course, the duplicating ray had a glitch. Anything that gets duplicated will spontaneously duplicate itself after a brief period of time. Pretty soon, Duckburg was swimming in duplicated cash, lollipops cost a wheelbarrow full of coins, and the price of the new bike that had started all this had increased 100-fold. Uncle Scrooge was of course wiped out, as the coins he had so carefully hoarded in his money bin were now all worthless. Not a pretty sight. So, first of all, don't tell me that silly anthropomorphic cartoons have no educational value, and second, that this is exactly what happened to the Roman Empire as revenue failed to meet expenditures during the 3rd century. The imperial reaction was to simply produce more money so that they could pay off all their debts, leading to spiraling prices, savings being wiped out, and a reversion, eventually, back to primitive barter and payments in kind. Adding to these economic woes, that in the 260s were still looming on the horizon, was the fact that with the imperial mines running dry, and no new sources of silver and gold anywhere to be found, the emperors were forced to debase the coinage to keep up with the increased rate of production. Debasement was of course nothing new, but the process had thus far been pretty gradual, and the market had been given time to adjust. In the 200 years from Augustus to Septimius Severus, the standard denarius had declined its silver content from 98% to just about 50%. In the 50 years since the death of Severus, though, the silver content plummeted to just 1.5%. 1.5. This was a silver ratio so low that the denarius literally no longer resembled itself. The various emperors had done all this in secret, of course, because, while they may not have understood inflation, they certainly understood the dangerous ramifications of making their coins intrinsically less valuable. But it did not take long for people to catch on. Despite multiple imperial declarations stating that all coins should be accepted at face value, savvy merchants of the 3rd century began adjusting their prices by the weight of their customers' coins, rather than simply counting the number of them. But as I just said, It took a little while for the effects of all these monetary shenanigans to be felt, and Gallienus mostly benefited from his printing of more money, despite the fact that it was bad money. As I've mentioned a few times previously, coins in the Roman Empire were a primary vehicle of imperial propaganda, and with each new batch of coins flooding out into the provinces, the citizens of the empire became awash not just in cash, but with the persistent drumbeat message that everything was fine, everyone was getting along, the empire was safe, the armies were happy, and the emperor was on the case. There were of course outward signs that all of this was perhaps not as true as the emperor would like it to be, but one rule of mass media is that if you repeat something enough times, a lot of people are going to start believing it. Gallienus repeated himself a lot, and with no opposing media outlets contradicting him, many citizens simply shrugged their shoulders and believed him. The 260s AD are often represented as the nadir of Roman fortunes. The empire was divided from itself, and men were rising up in revolt almost daily against an ineffectual emperor who seemed content to let it all burn. But this is an oversimplification, an exaggeration, and, bluntly, untrue. Gallienus, like Domitian before him, has been absolutely vilified. But when we look back with a more sober eye on the period, we find that he was not at all ineffectual, that he vigorously and actively defended the empire from foreign invasion and attempted to put the broken pieces of Roman society back together. He did indeed preside over a divided empire, but with everything Rome was facing, the temporary division probably wound up profiting the empire in the end. What did not profit the empire was Gallienus' monetary policies, which came back to haunt Rome in a big way. But even in this, it's not like Gallienus invented debasement or the overcoining of money. The son of Valerian was certainly not the best emperor. Indeed, he was about to be shown by Aurelian what a really good emperor can do when he puts his mind to something, worst either. Next week, we will get to the fall of this not great but not terrible emperor. Either by coincidence or fate, the death of Gallienus was matched almost simultaneously by the deaths of Postumus in the west and Odenathus in the east. Within the span of a single year, the three men who had dominated the lives of Romans everywhere were dead, leaving power vacuums in all three corners of the empire. While the west would fall into the hands of unworthy successors, the east would be claimed by the wife of Odenathus, the Palmyrene queen Zenobia, who would in time prove to be her husband's equal in every way. And had she not run up against Aurelian, it is very possible that she would have emerged as his better in every way. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again is audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a